Imagine looking out your window and seeing the ocean boiling like a giant kettle. The air so thick with heat and humidity that every breath scorches your lungs. Asphalt melts under your feet, bridge joints twist and snap, and endless wildfires paint the horizon red. This isn't a scene from a Hollywood disaster film. This was Earth, millions of years before humans existed. A planet where the poles weren't frozen wastelands but lush rainforests, where giant penguins roamed tropical beaches in Antarctica, and crocodiles thrived in places that today lie under ice. Our world has worn many faces, from blistering hothouse to frozen icehouse, and each shift didn't just reshape the continents and oceans, it rewrote the rules of survival for every living thing. Entire ecosystems vanished while new ones bloomed, and in the chaos of these cycles, the conditions for humanity's rise were slowly forged. To understand where we came from, we have to journey deep into prehistory, to witness boiling seas, burning skies, and glaciers that could swallow whole continents, and discover what our planet was truly like when the first chapters of the human story began. Chapter 1. The Day the Earth Sweated. 56 million years ago, Earth was gripped by a fever unlike anything seen in millions of years. A sudden planet-wide heat wave that scientists today call the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, PETM. It wasn't just a warm spell. It was a climatic convulsion that sent global temperatures soaring by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius, above an already toasty baseline. This was no gentle rise, no gradual shift over hundreds of thousands of years. It was a geological blink, a runaway heat surge that transformed the planet into a vast, steaming greenhouse. If you could step out of a time machine and into that sweltering world, the first sensation would hit you like a blow, an all-encompassing, oppressive wall of heat, as though you had opened the door to an oven large enough to hold continents. The air itself would feel heavy, thick with moisture, clinging to your skin in an endless, suffocating embrace. The oceans, which might seem like a refuge from such relentless heat, offered no comfort. Their surface waters were hot enough to feel like an enormous, churning hot tub, but far less relaxing, for they had grown dangerously acidic. The excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere dissolving into the seas and upsetting the delicate chemical balance that countless marine organisms depended upon. Creatures that built shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate, from tiny plankton invisible to the naked eye, to giant clams the size of dinner plates, found their very survival threatened. In the deep oceans, where life had long thrived in frigid stability, the warmth penetrated downward, robbing the water of oxygen. Ancient, cold water species gasped in this alien environment, and vast stretches of the seafloor became silent graveyards, their ecosystems suffocated. At the poles, however, a strange and vibrant paradise emerged. The ice sheets we know today were entirely absent. In their place, temperate rainforests stretched across the high latitudes, basking under long summer days and dim winter light. These polar forests were dense and alive. Towering conifers and broad-leaved trees mingled with ferns and flowering plants, their leaves glistening with dew under a sun that barely dipped below the horizon. Fossils tell us that giant penguins, some taller than a human, waddled along the sandy, ice-free beaches of Antarctica, while small, tree-dwelling sloths clung to branches overhead, their claws wrapped around limbs swaying in the warm southern breeze. In the far north, crocodiles basked on riverbanks. Turtles paddled lazily through shaded waterways, and dragonflies the size of a man's hand hovered in the humid air. The Arctic of the PETM was not a frozen wasteland, but a lush, green sanctuary, alive with sound and movement. But the equator, the planet's traditional cradle of biodiversity, had become a furnace. Average annual temperatures there ranged from 40 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius, with daytime highs even more brutal. Many regions near the equator became so hot that complex life could not survive, forcing plants and animals to abandon their ancestral homes and migrate toward the poles. Rainforests expanded outward from the tropics, wrapping around the Earth in a continuous emerald belt that reached into what we now think of as the Arctic Circle. The cause of this planetary fever remains one of science's great mysteries. Some evidence points to massive volcanic eruptions, perhaps in what is now Iceland, pumping gigatons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Others suggest a sudden release of methane from frozen hydrates on the seafloor, a potent greenhouse gas far more powerful than CO2, possibly triggered by tectonic shifts or ocean warming. Still others propose the burning of ancient peatlands, releasing stored carbon into the skies. Whatever the trigger, the result was catastrophic and immediate. Ocean currents faltered or changed direction, disrupting the global conveyor belt of heat and nutrients. Monsoon systems became erratic. Regions that had known regular wet and dry seasons drowned under year-round deluges, while others dried into dusty plains that baked under relentless suns. In the chaos, ecosystems reshuffled. Entire communities of plants and animals collapsed in some regions, while in others, strange and unexpected habitats appeared, offering new opportunities for those able to adapt quickly. Warm forests became natural highways for migration, stretching across continents and even linking landmasses at high latitudes. These routes allowed species to move in ways impossible today. One of the most remarkable travelers was Teilhardina, a tiny lemur-like primate with enormous night-adapted eyes and a quick, agile body. Fossil evidence shows that Teilhardina appeared almost simultaneously in Asia, Europe, and North America, an astonishing feat that suggests it used the PETM's interconnected forests to spread across the globe within a few thousand years, a heartbeat in geological time. Other animals, early horses no bigger than a house cat, nimble carnivores, and tropical reptiles, also made these poleward journeys, following the forests to new lands. For nearly 200,000 years, this overheated Earth endured. It was not a stable paradise, but a restless, reshaped planet. Slowly, natural processes began to draw down the excess carbon. Chemical weathering of rocks pulled CO2 from the air, plants captured and buried carbon in soils, and the oceans absorbed vast quantities over millennia. The fever broke gradually, but the PETM left scars and legacies that would persist for millions of years. Coastlines shifted with rising seas, climate zones were redrawn, evolutionary paths were diverted, accelerated, or erased. Lineages adapted, migrated, or vanished entirely. And though humanity was still tens of millions of years away, the events of this hothouse interlude set in motion changes in ecosystems, geography, and climate systems that would ultimately help shape the world into which our distant ancestors would one day step. The Earth had sweated, suffered, and transformed. And in its transformation, it was already writing the opening lines of the human story. Chapter 2. When the world cooled. After nearly 200,000 years of relentless heat, the fever finally began to break. The Earth, once wrapped in a blanket of suffocating greenhouse gases, started to cool. Not in a sudden shiver, but through a slow, grinding process that unfolded over millions of years. The lush rainforests that had marched across the Arctic began their retreat, giving ground to temperate woodlands, grasslands, and eventually, tundra. This cooling wasn't caused by a single event, but by a combination of planetary forces quietly rewriting the climate. Newly risen mountain ranges like the Himalayas were exposing vast surfaces of fresh rock to the atmosphere. Rainwater, slightly acidic from dissolved carbon dioxide, weathered these rocks and locked carbon away in sediments carried to the oceans. Over geological time, this acted like a planetary air conditioner, drawing down CO2 levels and weakening the greenhouse effect. At the same time, tectonic shifts were rearranging ocean gateways, allowing cold polar waters to flow more freely into the deep sea, storing even more carbon and stabilizing global temperatures. The change was dramatic in the long view, from a hothouse Earth with ice-free poles to what scientists call a coolhouse climate, a more moderate world with seasonal contrasts sharper than anything life had known for tens of millions of years. For animals and plants adapted to perpetual warmth, this shift was a gauntlet. Entire tropical ecosystems shrank or fragmented, and species unable to migrate or adapt disappeared. In Africa, Asia, and the Americas, forests became patchworks, broken by expanding open spaces of grass and scrub. Grass itself, a relatively recent evolutionary player, began to spread with quiet determination, its silica-laced blades wearing down the teeth of any herbivore bold enough to graze. This subtle green revolution changed everything. Grazers evolved longer limbs and stronger jaws. Predators became faster and more strategic, and vast open habitats replaced dense canopies, favoring endurance over stealth. Rainfall patterns shifted too. The once predictable wet and dry cycles of entire continents were disrupted by the rise of powerful monsoon systems, particularly in Asia, where the Himalayas altered wind and precipitation flows on a continental scale. In Africa, these changes meant that lush rainforests were slowly pushed back toward the equator, replaced in many regions by savannas and seasonal grasslands. For the primates that would one day give rise to humans, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. Those that clung to shrinking forests stayed small, arboreal, and specialized. Others, however, ventured into the open, learning to navigate a world where trees were sparse and dangers more visible, but also more avoidable if you could move quickly and efficiently. Over millions of years, these early risk-takers would adapt to a life between worlds, part forest, part plain, developing traits that favored mobility, vision, and cooperation. The cooling climate also brought with it another subtle gift: variety. No longer was the planet divided into endless belts of unchanging tropical heat. Instead, environments shifted with latitude, altitude, and season. For evolving primates, this mosaic of habitats meant constant problem-solving, finding food in new places, surviving in both wet and dry seasons, and enduring temperature swings unknown in their ancient past. This environmental unpredictability became a crucible for adaptability, and adaptability, more than any single trait, would become the hallmark of the human lineage. By the time Earth settled firmly into its coolhouse rhythm, the stage was set for the next great transition: the arrival of the Ice Age cycles that would sculpt landscapes, test survival strategies, and push our ancestors to the very edge of endurance. Chapter 3: The Age of Ice and Fire. Roughly 2.6 million years ago, the world slipped into a new and unforgiving rhythm, a geological heartbeat of cold and warmth, known as the Quaternary Ice Age. But this was no single, endless, deep freeze. Instead, It was an unrelenting cycle of glacial periods and interglacials, a cosmic pendulum driven by subtle changes in Earth's orbit, tilt, and wobble. The Milankovitch cycles, which altered how sunlight reached different parts of the globe. When the pendulum swung toward cold, ice sheets grew from the poles like advancing armies of glass, their frozen fronts crawling southward at a pace, too slow to see in a lifetime, yet unstoppable over centuries. These glaciers ground across continents, pulverizing rock into fine dust, gouging valleys, and remaking the face of the planet. Sea levels fell by more than 100 meters as trillions of tons of water locked itself into towering domes of ice, revealing vast new landscapes. Land bridges like the one that once connected Siberia to Alaska or Britain to mainland Europe, creating temporary highways for migration, only to drown them again when the ice melted. During the coldest times, the world's climate was harsher, drier, and windier. Deserts expanded, grasslands shrank, and forests retreated toward the equator. In warmer interglacials, ice retreated, rivers swelled, and life surged north and south again, reclaiming the abandoned land in a green rush. But these shifts were not gentle transitions. They were environmental whiplash. Entire ecosystems could vanish within a few thousand years, a blink on the geological clock, forcing animals and plants to either adapt quickly, migrate vast distances, or perish. In Africa, the ancestral home of humankind, these violent climate swings rewrote the map of survival over and over. One millennium might see wide, open savannas rich with grazing herds and prowling predators. The next might bring relentless drought, lakes shrinking into cracked basins and grasslands turning into arid scrubland. For early hominins, descendants of the adaptable forest-edge primates shaped during the earlier cooling period, this instability was both a curse and a gift. It tore away the safety of predictable environments, but it also rewarded the bold and the inventive. Walking upright became more than a quirk of evolution. It was an essential survival strategy, allowing these early humans to travel long distances under the sun, to see over tall grass, to carry food, tools, and infants with them. The hands freed by bipedalism became engines of innovation, gripping stones to crack bones for marrow, shaping crude cutting edges to strip meat from scavenged carcasses, and later, crafting spears and fire-hardened tools to hunt. These new abilities fed more than just the stomach. They fed the brain. Meat and marrow offered concentrated calories and nutrients, fueling the slow expansion of human intelligence, while the constant pressure to adapt sharpened memory, planning, and social cooperation. The Ice Age world was unforgiving to the solitary. Survival demanded teamwork, sharing resources, and communicating complex ideas. Over hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors became skilled nomads, reading landscapes for signs of water, tracking herds across vast distances, and remembering routes through territories that changed with every glacial pulse. When the ice retreated during warmer interglacials, humans followed rivers and coastlines into new territories, crossing exposed land bridges to populate distant lands, moving out of Africa into the Middle East, into Asia, and eventually into Europe and the Americas. But each expansion was temporary. When the cold returned, populations were driven back or cut off, sometimes vanishing entirely. This endless testing ground did not just shape where humans lived, it shaped who humans were. It selected for endurance, for versatility, for the ability to think ahead and imagine tools or shelters that did not yet exist. It forged us into a species capable of thriving in deserts, forests, grasslands, and icy plains alike. By the time the last great glaciers began to melt around 12,000 years ago, the ice had sculpted more than just valleys and lakes. It had sculpted minds, bodies, and cultures. The age of ice and fire was the relentless teacher that trained humanity to survive a planet in flux, turning fragility into resilience, and laying the final evolutionary groundwork for the rise of civilization. Chapter 4. The Dawn of Our World. Around 12,000 years ago, the last great glacial curtain began its slow retreat, marking the end of the most recent ice age and the beginning of the Holocene, the warm interglacial in which we still live. The transformation was immense and irreversible. Colossal ice sheets that had loomed over North America, Europe, and Asia melted into roaring rivers and swelling seas, raising global water levels by more than 100 meters. Entire coastlines vanished beneath the encroaching ocean, drowning river valleys and lowland plains, erasing land bridges that had once connected continents. The Bering Land Bridge that had linked Siberia to Alaska was swallowed by the rising Pacific, cutting off a migration route that had brought humans into the Americas. Britain became an island as the waters of the North Sea poured in, severing it from mainland Europe. In Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, the climate grew warmer and wetter, and ecosystems flourished where ice and aridity had once reigned. For the humans who had endured the violent swings of the Ice Age, this newfound stability was a gift, but also a challenge. The great herds of mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and giant deer that had roamed the cold steppe grasslands began to vanish, victims of both human hunting and shrinking habitats. Faced with dwindling big game, our ancestors turned increasingly to plants, not just gathering what grew naturally, but experimenting with sowing, tending, and harvesting. This quiet agricultural revolution began independently in several places: wheat and barley along the Fertile Crescent, rice in the valleys of China, maize in the Americas. The shift from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled farming was nothing less than a pivot point in human history. Villages appeared where seasonal camps had once stood, their permanence marked by storage pits, stone houses, and communal hearths. Food surpluses allowed populations to grow beyond the limits of what the land could support through foraging alone. This, in turn, gave rise to specialization. Some people farmed, others crafted tools, wove textiles, shaped pottery, or organized trade. In river valleys like the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the Indus, farming supported the first cities, dense human hives where culture, technology, and power concentrated. Writing systems emerged to track harvests and debts. Laws were carved into stone to govern disputes. Monumental architecture rose as symbols of authority and devotion. The same rivers that nourished crops also became the highways of early empires, connecting distant communities into webs of exchange. Yet this new human world was not without cost. Clearing forests for fields altered ecosystems. Irrigation changed the flow of rivers. Domestic animals spread diseases to humans. And with permanent settlements came inequality, competition for resources, and organized warfare. The Holocene was stable enough to support the rise of civilization, but it was not static. Volcanic eruptions, droughts, and sudden floods still reshaped human fortunes. Some societies collapsed under these pressures, while others adapted, innovating new forms of governance, trade, and technology. What defined the era was not the absence of challenge, but humanity's growing ability to meet those challenges by reshaping the environment itself. By the close of the first few thousand years of the Holocene, humans had gone from scattered Ice Age bands to masters of agriculture, builders of cities, and architects of complex cultures. We had stepped firmly into a world of our own making. A world where the greatest force of change was no longer ice or fire, but us. Chapter 5. The Age of Empires and Ideas. As the Holocene centuries unfolded, humanity's scattered civilizations began to stretch their reach far beyond the river valleys where they were born, weaving the first true networks of trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. By around 3000 BCE, the world had entered what might be called its first global age, not in the sense of planetary unification, but in the sense that ideas, goods, and technologies could leap vast distances through chains of contact. Empires rose in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and along the Yellow River, each drawing strength from the fertile soils and predictable floods that agriculture had made possible. But these were not isolated giants. They were restless powers, driven to expand their borders, secure resources, and control trade routes. Bronze, forged from tin and copper mined in distant lands, became the weapon and tool of the age, sparking new demands for long-distance exchange. Caravans of camels traced slow paths across deserts. Merchant ships braved the seasonal monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean, and overland routes through Central Asia, precursors to the Silk Road, began carrying not just goods, but ideas, languages, and religions. Writing flourished in many forms: cuneiform on clay, hieroglyphs on temple walls, oracle bone, inscriptions in China, each a tool for administration, diplomacy, and the preservation of knowledge. Empires were held together by more than armies. They relied on systems of law, taxation, and infrastructure, from roads and aqueducts to massive storehouses. Yet the age of empires was as much an age of ideas as of power. Philosophers, priests, and storytellers shaped the mental worlds of their societies, crafting myths that justified rule, moral codes that bound communities, and visions of the cosmos that made sense of human struggles. In Egypt, monumental stone pyramids proclaimed the divine authority of pharaohs. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats reached toward the heavens as centers of both worship and governance. In the Indus Valley, grid-planned cities with advanced drainage systems hinted at civic ideals yet to be fully understood. The spread of ideas was not always peaceful. Conquest often carried cultural exchange on the edge of a sword, but it was transformative. The chariot, domesticated horse, and composite bow changed the face of warfare. Mathematics and astronomy advanced to predict floods, track celestial events, and guide navigation. Over centuries, these developments knit together regions that had once been isolated, laying the groundwork for what would one day become true global connections. But empires were fragile things. Their greatness balanced on the edge of climate shifts, internal rebellion, and the ambitions of rival powers. Many collapsed as quickly as they rose, leaving behind ruins and scattered legacies for later civilizations to inherit. Still, each fall left behind something more enduring than walls or statues: the flow of knowledge. Techniques in agriculture, architecture, metallurgy, and governance passed along the trade routes, crossing languages and borders, mutating and improving with each exchange. By the close of the ancient era, humanity had not only learned to shape its environment, but to shape the flow of ideas itself, a skill that would one day prove even more powerful than bronze or iron. The Age of Empires and Ideas was humanity's apprenticeship in complexity, a period in which we learned that the true strength of a civilization was not just in the size of its armies or the walls of its cities, but in its ability to adapt, adopt, and imagine a world larger than itself. From the planet's fiery beginnings to the shifting climates of ice and fire, from the first stone tools chipped in the shadows of African savannas to the rise of empires that spanned continents. The story of Earth and humanity is one of constant transformation. The ground beneath our feet has never been still. Oceans have risen and fallen, mountains have been ground to dust, and climates have swung between extremes that would seem alien to us today. Yet through every upheaval, asteroid strikes, volcanic winters, scorching hothouses, and crushing ice ages, life has persisted, adapted, and evolved, with our species emerging, not as a passive passenger, but as a master navigator of change. We are the heirs of countless experiments in survival, forged by scarcity and abundance, by migration and innovation, by the delicate interplay of cooperation and conflict. The cities we live in, the technologies we wield, and the stories we tell are the latest layers in a tapestry millions of years in the making, woven from threads of geology, biology, and imagination. But this story is not complete. The same forces that shaped our past are still at work, and the choices we make today will ripple forward into the deep future. Just as our ancestors faced shifting worlds and found ways to adapt, we now stand at the edge of our own turning point, holding in our hands the power to shape not only the next chapter of human history, but the very destiny of the planet itself.